I think, what I prioritize in the work is this idea of sort of a comically dark narrative of something that is both innocent and yet violent and humane. It's kind of this composite of consciousness that maybe the hope is that someone will get a laugh. Maybe they'll be have a moment of surprise, that in some way that interaction with the piece, I don't want to predetermine that. I want the piece to ask the question. I don't want the piece to be the answer. Now, where the work comes from on my end, it's coming out of my consciousness and my subconscious. It's coming out of dreams, it's coming out of memory. So for me, of course, it is deeply personal, but I don't think that that's necessarily important for the viewer. I think it's more important that they get a sense of play and a sense of fun. Largely, I think of my practice as being sort of a collagist mentality, where I'm not trying to get the image in one go. I'm trying to do hundreds of iterations of images and then pull them together, usually stitch them together into the final piece. What wound up happening is when I took a step away from the 2D and moved into the diorama realm, it also opened up the work to the idea of video or navigating a painting in space. And so there's linear perspective that you think of when you think about painting, but then there's also physical space that a painting can inhabit. And so for me, I like the tension of how those two things can both reinforce each other or sort of break that sort of psychological idea of how we perceive both two-dimensional and three-dimensional space. There's like a little area in the middle for almost like magic tricks to happen. So that's part of the reason why the work has danced between a sort of a painterly approach, but then also figuring out physically how to make it grow in space. When the Hilliard first reached out to me to take a look at the space, which is about 60 feet deep, and it's about 13 feet tall, I realized that if I wanted to work with watercolor, paper was not an option, because once it reaches a certain scale with a water-based material, it'll buckle and it won't be able to handle, first of all, the scale, and also the fact that the space is open to the heat and the humidity in the ceiling and the floor. So I went a little bit down the rabbit hole trying to figure out how to turn the canvas into a water-absorbent surface that would act as paper, which I was able to do, but I had to create a test piece that has actually been living in my carport for about 8 months to make sure that it didn't fade or crack under the pressure of the Louisiana climate. So the surfaces are essentially stretched like normal canvases would be. They have a size put on them that's just a PVA glue. Then they have multiple rounds of gesso and sanding, which is a normal sort of surface for painting. But then they have a water-absorbent ground placed on top, which that is what actually allows the watercolor to sit and sink in and cure so that it can be exposed to the elements. So all of these paintings were made laying down in my living room so that they could cure without having the water drip or move anywhere that it didn't need to go. This piece was created throughout the pandemic. And there were a couple of months after the pandemic started that it was almost hard to keep maneuvering with the work. You start to get a little introspective and think about just sort of this crisis moment of the world and how there's just so little predictability. And my work is totally based on the unpredictable and the uncanny. So it was hitting a little bit close to home for me, in that I am interested in the work in a reality that is maybe not what we would expect it to be. And yet the work and reality were getting closer and closer together with the intensity of the moment of 2020. And so I think calling this year a fever dream is not that far off for a lot of people, because their day-to-day natural experiences, even their interactions with other people, nothing has been the standard expectation. And so in that way, the work felt terribly relevant and also really hard to make, to the point where I sort of had to turn up the funnier narratives. You know, I had to add in some animals, and I had to kind of make it alive for myself again, and try to bring that breath of like excitement to it that wasn't focused on the deep intensity of the moment. The way that I work generally in the studio, even beyond this install, is that I will do a series of drawings, maybe 20 to 50 at a clip, and I stack them up and I put them away, and it can come from day-to-day interaction, it can come from memory, it can come from the dream I had the night before, and I kind of put them away. I pull them all out at the same time, and it's sort of like a carnivore process. I cut them all up and I sort of seam them together, and in that way they make a new reality or a new idea. It opens me up to be flexible. So when this project got started and I realized the scale that it was at, and I realized that the investment in time and materials to try to make it happen, that probably flying without some idea of a safety net might not be the best idea. So I actually built a to-scale model of the piece using my stack of 50 or so drawings that I had laying around. And then I could systematically scale up each individual piece to be life-size or larger, so that when it came into the museum, we could actually reference the model as we installed, getting things to line up so that you see them at one angle but not at another. All of those things, you need to have some point of reference, both for yourself and for the people who are helping you, so that it's not just sort of floating in the air, the idea. What gets me really excited when I start to think about a project is thinking about world building. It's thinking about, how do I extend this past just one narrative or a linear narrative? How do I make it so complicated that the viewer has to look at it or get engaged with it from multiple vantage points? And so in that way, working with the diorama or working out of sort of this idea of the theater, I think that lends itself really well to thinking about being a storyteller. I also, you know, at the root of my process is this little utilitarian spirit that really loves the idea that whatever I stitch together, I can also cut apart. It's the reason I don't use any adhesive in my work, is because a lot of times I'll think that a piece has to go in one particular area, but then it winds up not to be right, and I just cut the strings and move it. And so very much the monofilament being the major adhesive in the entirety of the piece, it's very reassuring to me from the standpoint of creating that if it's wrong, I can always just cut the strings and redo it. During my undergraduate work, I worked for 2 years as an intern at the Metropolitan Museum of Art with their conservation team. That experience changed a lot for me as an artist, not so much in, you know, I will sort of walk on my pieces and I won't treat them very kindly, but it's very important to me that when I am creating a piece, that it can not only do what I need it to do in the space with the idea, but that it can handle whatever intervention or whatever situation that I put the work into. I feel like to be an artist, to think conceptually is part of it, but also to be very thoughtful in your craftsmanship. To me, that's something that I care a lot about. I think it means that you respect and you're cognizant of the process and of the fact that it is a privilege to be an artist. The way that I view art history and contemporary art and this magical community of artists that I get to live alongside is that I see it as a huge network. And I don't mean that in the digital sense. I mean, it's a network that you can tap into at any point in time, no matter where you are. And it traverses space, it traverses time. It's kind of incredible. It's something that's a source of nourishment that is always present. And so for me, it's not about competition. It's not about breaking new ground so much as it is about, like, how do I challenge my practice to reinvent itself each time? And how do I look to my peers or to the people who came before me to make informed decisions about the best way to approach what I'm doing? We're all sort of in communication or in dialogue, and that's something that I think has helped ground me at moments when you're not sure where the work is going, or you're not sure why you're doing what you're doing, or maybe it doesn't feel like it's very relevant. Trusting that not only the process will sort itself out, but also that the people and the work that you're surrounded by are in support of you figuring it out. That's essential. It's huge. It's something that I put a lot of value on. My mentor, Barbara Campbell Thomas, who has been just an incredible source of clarity and support over the course of this process. She said to me that your process is like the thread, and the thread insofar as the idea of something that can be pulled out, it can be pulled in, it can be maneuvered around all of the other things that might be happening in the moment, but that the thread is always there. And that's how I look at artwork moving through my life or moving through the world. I'm not looking at it as, oh, I hope that someone will remember me. I'm looking at it as an active living thing that's part of my existence. So I, in my heart, consider myself a classically trained painter's painter in my soul. When I think about the artists that I love, it's the painters that I always circle back around to. And it's because they are accessing space in their work. They might not be doing it in a sculptural sense or in a video sense, but there's so much programmed into the way that they are breaking down or conflating space. So for me, I center myself around that. I get a lot of peace thinking through painting. But I think in this moment where you have so many options, that if you're willing to really follow the idea of the work, you can't limit yourself to just painting. You have to be open to the possibility that the answer to the idea that you're circling around might be outside of your purview. So, even so far as I'm not trained as a videographer or an animator, and sometimes the work comes out terribly clunky because of that, but I need to solve the problem. And I think at the root of it, that's what you're doing. You're thinking about, how do I solve the problem in the most effective way possible? And so to be defined just purely by one medium, at that point, I found it a little bit limiting in the potential of where the work could go. I originally started working with watercolor as a child. It was something that during my formal education I didn't take very seriously. It was my way of drawing automatically. And when I started to generate imagery that was based off of more than just conscious reality, I found that working with watercolor was more immediate. And so it was a way for me to access information on a subconscious level that I couldn't do quite so well when I was working with oil or acrylic. And so this was really the first time that I think I opened up that medium as being more than just sort of in the background, and allowed it to take center stage to really support the concept behind the work. I was taught to draw by my grandma, Helen Gordon. I was 7 years old, and she sat me down at the kitchen table with a set of cake to watercolors, which I still have, and actually a little packet of sewing needles and thread. And so indirectly, maybe not, she couldn't have possibly known at the time, that would be the basis for most of my work moving forward.